April 1945. The war was dying but not yet dead. Mist rolled across the open fields of a makeshift American prisoner of war camp somewhere in rural France. Wooden guard towers rose like quiet silhouettes against a pale morning sky. Barbed wire glistened with dew. Behind it, hundreds of captured Germans stood in silence. Soldiers, sailors, and officers once sworn to the Reich. Among them stood a man who did not belong to the chaos. His uniform was still pressed, his posture still proud. Kapitän Sergei Heinrich Vogel, a veteran of the Atlantic, commander of a U-boat that once prowled beneath the dark waves. Now his war was over. Across the fence, a young American private, 19, maybe 20, shifted his weight, rifle in hand. His name tag read Carter. He had never left Kansas before the war. Their eyes met through the wire. Two worlds that had fought to destroy each other now stood face to face, divided by fences, bound by silence. And that morning, something unexpected began. By the spring of 1945, the world had become a graveyard of nations. Germany's once triumphant armies were retreating on every front. The Red Army had crossed the Oder, only 100 kilometers from Berlin. In the west, the Allies were pushing deep into the heart of the Reich. Every day, more German divisions laid down their arms, surrendering by the thousands. The Third Reich, that machine that once promised 1,000 years of power, had only weeks left to live. In the ruins of cities, officers burned papers, civilians dug shelters, and soldiers looked over their shoulders, wondering if the next day would be their last. For many of them, surrender was not defeat. It was survival. The Atlantic War, the long and cold campaign fought beneath the waves, was ending too. The U-boats that had once strangled Allied shipping now hid in harbors, hunted from the sky. Allied air power and sonar technology had turned the hunter into prey. Germany's proud submarine service, the Kriegsmarines Unterseebootwaffe, had lost over 750 boats. Tens of thousands of sailors had gone down with them, swallowed by the Atlantic. Those who survived emerged into a world that no longer needed them. Kapitän Heinrich Vogel was one of them. He had commanded U-413 in the Bay of Biscay, a steel predator in the early years of the war. But by 1944, his luck had run out. Allied convoys traveled in packs, covered by escort carriers and depth charges. His boat was hit off the coast of Ireland, forced to the surface, and captured by British destroyers. When the British handed over hundreds of German naval prisoners to American custody in 1945, Vogel was among them. He was shipped to a temporary POW camp in France before eventually being sent to the United States. But the moment we focus on happened before that transfer, in those quiet, strange weeks between defeat and departure. The camp itself was a patchwork of barracks, fences, and mud. American engineers had built it in a matter of days, designed to hold men, not comfort them. The air smelled of diesel, wet earth, and boiled rations. Yet in this harsh place a strange order prevailed. The Germans rose at dawn for roll call, ate their rations in silence, and kept their barracks clean as if still aboard a ship. Old habits died hard. On the other side of the fence, the guards were just boys. Farm kids from Iowa, mechanics from Ohio, students from California. Many had never seen combat. They had been trained quickly in the art of guarding men who had once terrified the world. Their sergeants warned them to keep their distance. Don't talk to the Krauts. Don't drop your guard. But when the hours stretched on under the gray sky, rules became blurred. The war in Europe was ending, yet its echoes still moved through these camps. Each guard and each prisoner was a symbol of a world trying to understand itself again, and somewhere inside that, symbolic space between wire and watchtower, a conversation was waiting to begin. In the months before Germany's formal surrender, the prisoner of war camps across Europe became strange microcosms of the collapsing world order. Within the fences, the war seemed frozen in time. Outside, armies still fought for rivers and ruins. Inside, men who had once commanded divisions or ships found themselves counting the hours until dusk. The Geneva Convention had shaped how the Allies managed their captives. For the Americans, maintaining discipline and dignity was part of the mission. The United States held over 370,000 German POWs in Europe and more than 425,000 back home. Each camp was a world within a world, an experiment in control, order, and moral endurance. Kapitän Heinrich Vogel's camp, built hastily on French farmland, reflected the disarray of the time. Its guards worked 12-hour shifts. Its prisoners followed a strict schedule: roll call at dawn, work details by mid-morning, silence after sunset. The Germans had organized themselves into military units within the camp. Officers still gave commands, NCOs still enforced them. Some men even practiced naval drills in the open field. Wooden sticks in place of rifles. It was a way to hold on to identity, the only thing the barbed wire could not strip away. Yet beneath that order, uncertainty gnawed at them. They did not know if their families were alive, if their cities still stood, or if their homeland even existed anymore. Each rumor from the outside brought a wave of anxiety. Some clung to faith in Hitler's promised miracle weapons. Others, older and more weary, just wanted the war to end, no matter the cost. Among the prisoners, Vogel stood apart. Tall, silver-haired, and reserved, he carried himself with the dignity of command. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the men listened. His officers treated him with reverence. The guards saw him as the quiet one with the captain's stare. To many, he was still a symbol of the old German Navy, disciplined, proud, almost mythic. And then there was Private James Carter, barely 19. Carter had been drafted the previous summer, trained at Fort Benning, and shipped to Europe after D-Day. He had never fired his weapon in anger. The war ended before he ever reached a battlefield. Now his task was to watch over men who had once been his country's greatest enemies. For Carter, it was a strange duty, one that didn't feel heroic or meaningful. Each day began the same: dawn roll call, fence patrol, mealtime check, and long hours standing guard as the wind swept through the camp. He saw the prisoners not as villains but as men, tired, hollow-eyed, just like his older brother who'd fought in the Ardennes. One morning, while making his rounds near the officers' enclosure, Carter noticed the German captain sitting alone on a wooden crate, sketching on a scrap of paper. Curious but cautious, he lingered nearby. Vogel looked up briefly, nodded once, not as a prisoner to a guard, but as one soldier to another. It was a fleeting gesture, but it broke something invisible in the air. Over the following days, that silent acknowledgement turned into a habit. A look, a word, a shared cigarette through the fence. To both men, it meant little at first. To history, it would mean everything, for in that small, forgotten camp at the end of the world, the war between nations was giving way to something rarer, the quiet rediscovery of humanity. War strips men of identity, yet in captivity, identity often returns in unexpected forms. For Captain Heinrich Vogel, the walls of command had collapsed. The ocean that once obeyed his will was gone, his crew scattered, his authority reduced to the boundaries of a fenced field. He no longer held power over men, only over his silence. Private James Carter, on the other hand, was still shaping his identity. Too young to remember the early years of the war, he had grown up on radio bulletins and newspaper headlines that painted Germans as faceless enemies. Yet now, in the stillness of the camp, he saw something different. The tired faces of men who looked like his uncles, not monsters from propaganda posters. Their first real exchange came over a simple act: a piece of bread. Vogel had been standing by the wire when Carter, finishing his meal, tore off a crust and handed it through the fence. It was against regulation, but no one noticed. Vogel hesitated, then accepted it with a nod that carried a strange gravity, the silent language of mutual recognition. In that moment, war's machinery seemed to pause. Two men on opposite sides of history shared a gesture as old as civilization: hunger, fatigue, and respect, all mingled into one fragile moment of understanding. And though they said little, something began to change. The tactical angle, every POW camp was a living machine of logistics and control. The U.S. Army had developed a system designed to prevent rebellion, maintain order, and uphold international law. Each guard was briefed on security protocols, distance rules, and the dangers of sympathy. But in reality, few camps saw violence. The German officers, trained in discipline, kept their men orderly. American guards, young and under strict command, rarely provoked conflict. The tension wasn't physical, it was psychological. The war had taught both sides how to hate, but captivity forced them to see the human cost of that hatred. Vogel's enclosure was watched by 4 guard posts, each manned in rotating shifts. Carter often drew the early morning duty. the coldest and loneliest hours. It was during these shifts that Vogel noticed him. The boy's posture reminded him of one of his own youngest officers, eager, uncertain, trying to appear older than he was. Carter, for his part, observed Vogel's routine with quiet fascination. Every morning at dawn, the captain would line up his small group of officers, conduct a brief roll call, and end with a crisp salute to no one in particular. A salute to order itself, to memory, to the sea. For a guard trained to see only risk and obedience, there was something strangely noble in it. Carter began to understand that the war had not simply created villains and heroes. It had created men who, in another world, might have shared the same ship, the same mission. This silent observation, one man studying another, became its own form of dialogue. No words, no gestures, just recognition, the moral angle. The American command's policy was clear. Prisoners were to be treated humanely. But morality is easy to preach and harder to practice when scars are fresh. Many guards had lost family in the war. Some had walked through the wreckage of bombed French villages. Compassion felt like betrayal. Yet for Carter, morality wasn't a doctrine, it was instinct. He had seen the photographs from liberated camps, heard the broadcasts about atrocities, but standing face to face with these defeated men complicated everything. They were no longer Nazis. They were human beings trying to survive shame. And for Vogel, receiving kindness from an enemy was its own torment. He had fought believing his cause was righteous. That duty to his nation stood above all else. Now treated with decency by the very people he was taught to despise, he began to question the foundations of his loyalty. Carter's respect, quiet, unspoken, and genuine, became a mirror. In that mirror, Vogel saw not a conqueror or a captive, but a man accountable to his own choices. It was a heavy realization. Their story was not a friendship in the ordinary sense. It was something deeper, a fragile truce between generations, forged in silence, tested by memory, and it was only beginning. The two men came from worlds that could not have been more different. Vogel had been shaped by the old Germany, one of hierarchy, discipline, and a belief in order above all else. He had joined the Navy long before Hitler's rise, back when service to the flag meant something noble or at least clear. His upbringing was steeped in formality, polished boots, precise speech, iron restraint. Carter, by contrast, came from the loose soil of America's Midwest. He had grown up during the Depression, working on his father's farm where rules bent with the weather. To him, leadership wasn't inherited, it was earned. Authority wasn't sacred, it was temporary. When these two worlds met at the fence, their contrasts became lessons. Vogel marveled at the informality of the young guards, how they laughed with sergeants, spoke openly, even slouched on duty. It seemed undisciplined, even disrespectful, but he could not deny the warmth in it, the sense of freedom. Carter, meanwhile, saw in Vogel a living artifact, a man forged by a culture that demanded perfection. He noticed the way the captain's uniform, though faded, was still meticulously kept, every button polished. Even in defeat, Vogel carried himself like a man awaiting inspection. And in that, Carter glimpsed something America had not taught him, the dignity of endurance, the psychological angle as the days passed. The boundary between guard and prisoner grew thinner, not through rebellion, but through recognition. For Vogel, captivity was more than physical confinement, it was a reckoning. He had followed orders, served the Reich, believed in discipline and honor. But now, with every distant rumble of artillery and every rumor of surrender, he felt the moral ground beneath him collapse. He began to wonder what he would tell his crew, his family, his nation, if there was still a nation to return to. The sea had always been his refuge, but here, surrounded by wire and silence, the sea was gone. In its place stood a boy with kind eyes and a borrowed rifle. Carter noticed the captain's loneliness long before he understood it. He saw the way Vogel sometimes traced patterns in the dirt, perhaps the outline of a submarine's hull, perhaps just a memory taking shape. He wanted to ask about it, but language and duty stood between them. So instead he brought him paper and a pencil. It was a quiet rebellion, a gesture both small and enormous. Vogel accepted them without a word. The next day, Carter saw that the page had been filled. A careful drawing of the U-boat U-413, emerging from the Atlantic, its periscope cutting through the waves like a blade. Beneath it, in neat German script, a single word: Heimat. Home. That single act, that single word, turned the dynamic between them into something almost sacred. For Carter, it was the first time he realized that even the enemy had a home worth missing. For Vogel, it was the first time he allowed himself to mourn it. The symbolic angle history often forgets the quiet places where wars truly end. They don't end in surrender documents or parades, they end in moments like this, between two people who choose understanding over hate. Vogel represented the old world: obedience, hierarchy, and tragedy. Carter represented the new: freedom, youth, and possibility. Together they embodied the bridge between destruction and renewal. The captain, once the hunter of Allied convoys, now found himself guarded by the son of the land he had once targeted. Yet the symmetry was almost poetic. Vogel, the man of steel and silence, found compassion from a boy who had never seen war at sea. For Carter, the German captain became something like a teacher, not in lessons or speeches, but in the way he carried defeat, with a quiet grace that spoke louder than pride. In the weeks that followed, their small exchanges became a rhythm: a nod, a word, sometimes a drawing passed through the fence. It was not friendship in any ordinary sense, but something rarer: mutual dignity. And as the camp awaited the inevitable news from Berlin, both men knew that whatever came next would change them forever. The wind carried rumors of surrender. The guards spoke of peace. But peace, like war, demands a moment when everything breaks. That moment was coming. The end came not with gunfire, but with a radio crackle. It was early May 1945. The camp awoke to an unusual silence. No roll call, no shouted orders. In the guard hut, a sergeant was listening to a transmission coming through the static. The voice of a BBC announcer cut through the haze. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. The words rolled like thunder through the camp. The prisoners gathered instinctively near the fence, their faces pale and unreadable. Some stood with arms folded. Others lowered their heads. The officers said nothing. For men who had lived and killed by the rhythm of orders, there were none left to follow. Vogel stood at the edge of his enclosure, still as stone. He did not flinch, did not look away. Only his jaw tightened. For 5 years he had served a flag that now ceased to exist. He had outlived his nation. Carter was on duty that morning. He felt the weight of the moment but could not celebrate. The others did. Some shouted, others laughed. But Carter's eyes found Vogel's across the fence. The German captain's gaze was fixed on the sky, expression unreadable. For a long time, neither moved. Finally, Vogel spoke, his English hesitant but clear. "It is finished," he said. Carter nodded slowly. "Yeah," he replied. "It's over." It was the first full sentence they'd ever exchanged. Then came the question neither expected. "What will you do now?" Carter asked. Vogel looked down, his fingers tracing the wire between them. "I do not know," he said. "We fought for something that no longer exists, but a man must still live." There was no bitterness in his voice, only weariness. In that moment, Carter saw not the enemy, but the reflection of every soldier who'd ever returned home to an uncertain peace. He wanted to say something and to offer comfort, but found no words that fit. Instead, he stepped closer and extended his hand through the fence. Vogel hesitated. Then slowly he reached out and took it. Their handshake was brief, almost formal, but in its simplicity it carried a meaning far greater than celebration or surrender. It was the handshake of two survivors who understood in their bones what the war had cost. Around them, shouts echoed. Guards were ordered to separate the prisoners to prepare for relocation. Trucks rolled up with lists, orders, and confusion. The war machine was ending, but the machinery of aftermath had just begun. Carter and Vogel's last exchange came the following morning. The German officers were lined up for transport to a naval facility further inland. The prisoners carried their few belongings in sacks or tied bundles. Vogel, as senior officer, was among the first to board. Carter stood by the gate, rifle slung across his shoulder, pretending not to watch. When Vogel passed, he stopped for a moment, just enough to meet the young man's eyes one last time. He raised his hand in a naval salute, not as a captain to an enemy, but as one man acknowledging another's humanity. Carter returned it awkwardly, unsure of the protocol but certain of the feeling. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The truck roared to life, dust rose, and just like that, the moment was gone. But as Carter watched the convoy disappear over the ridge, he realized something. He would never again see war as simple. He had guarded a man once called the enemy. And in doings, the days following Germany's surrender blurred into a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. The camp, once alive with rigid schedules and guarded precision, now felt suspended, as if time itself had paused, uncertain what to do next. The guards had fewer orders, the prisoners fewer illusions. The war was over, but its meaning had yet to settle. Rumors spread quickly through the barbed wire. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Allies had divided Germany into zones. For many prisoners it was unthinkable, not because they still believed in victory, but because they could not imagine a world without the Reich. Their entire adult lives had existed within its shadow. Vogel spent his final evenings walking along the perimeter of his compound. The sun dipped low across the western sky, the direction of the sea he once commanded. Each sunset seemed to pull something from him, stripping away the layers of uniform, duty, and ideology until only the man remained. One night, as Carter stood watch, Vogel approached the fence again. He carried something folded, a page torn from his sketchbook. Without a word, he passed it through the wire. Carter took it, puzzled. It was a pencil drawing, a detailed rendering of the Atlantic at dawn. The waves were precise, almost photographic, their surface broken by a single periscope rising from the depths. Beneath it, Vogel had written 2 words, "Für den Frieden," for peace. Carter looked up. Vogel was already walking away. It was a gift, but also a confession. The captain's acknowledgement that all the pride, all the sacrifice, all the bloodshed had led to this. A moment of surrender not to an enemy, but to the truth. A week later, the camp began transferring prisoners to ports for shipment to the United States. Carter helped with the paperwork, thousands of names, ranks, and numbers. When he reached Vogel Heinrich, Kapitän zur See, his hand lingered on the line. He added a small mark beside the name, an invisible gesture of remembrance. On the morning of departure, the Germans were loaded into trucks once more. Vogel was among them, standing tall despite the exhaustion etched into his face. As the convoy prepared to leave, Carter climbed the watchtower for one last look. From that height, the camp stretched out like a quiet wound in the countryside. Rows of fences, tents, and the ghosts of a war already receding into history. Then, below, Vogel turned his head, as if sensing the eyes upon him. Their gazes met one final time. The captain raised a hand, fingers pressed together in a sailor's farewell. Carter responded instinctively, hand to brow. A crisp salute, imperfect but sincere. The truck engines rumbled to life, and the column moved toward the horizon. Dust rose behind it, and within minutes the camp was empty of sound. Only the flapping of a torn American flag on the watchtower broke the silence. Carter remained there long after the convoy disappeared. He thought about the strange path that had brought them both to that place. The ocean battles, the politics, the orders, and the simple human truth that had survived them all. He realized that, though the war had ended, understanding it would take a lifetime. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. It was no medal, no letter of commendation, just a fragment of connection between 2 men who had met where history broke apart. For Vogel, the road ahead would lead to a ship bound for the New World, captivity in another continent, another waiting camp, another silence. For Carter, it would lead home, to Kansas fields and quiet nights where he would remember a German captain who had once stood tall behind a wire fence, and who, for one fleeting moment, had looked at him not as a guard, but as an equal. That brief exchange, a handshake, a sketch, a salute, became the point where war gave way to something greater. And in that quiet passing between enemies, the world took its first breath of peace. Oh, he had learned the difference between victory and understanding. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the world exhaled, not in relief, but in exhaustion. The numbers were staggering. Over 60 million dead, entire cities erased, and a continent divided between victors who barely trusted one another. The guns had fallen silent, but the human reckoning had only begun. For Germany, surrender was not a conclusion, it was a collapse. The country was carved into 4 occupation zones, American, British, French, and Soviet. Its leaders were imprisoned or hunted. The Nuremberg trials, which began later that year, would attempt to assign guilt to a machinery of destruction that had consumed millions. But not every German was tried. Not every soldier had been a war criminal. The vast majority were men like Heinrich Vogel, professional officers trained in discipline rather than ideology, swept into a war they could neither refuse nor control. After his transfer across the Atlantic, Vogel became one of the hundreds of thousands of German POWs housed in America. Camps stretched from Texas to Wisconsin, built on farmland and military bases. The conditions were stark but humane. Prisoners were fed, clothed, and put to work, picking cotton, building roads, repairing machinery. For many, it was their first encounter with a land they had been taught to despise. To Vogel, America was a revelation. He saw no ruins, no bombed cities, no hungry civilians. The abundance of food, the openness of the people, and the casual confidence of daily life contrasted sharply with the austerity of his homeland. It was a quiet humiliation, but also an awakening. Letters were permitted after a time. Through them, Vogel learned that his wife and son had survived the bombings in Hamburg, though their home was gone. The words in her letter were brief, formal, yet filled with gratitude that he was alive. It was the first true moment of peace he had felt since the war began. For the Americans, the POW system became a strange experiment in rehabilitation. Prisoners attended classes, learned English, and were shown films about democracy and freedom. Many German officers dismissed it as propaganda, but some listened. Vogel was among them. He did not renounce his service. He still believed in duty, in honor. But he began to see that loyalty to a system could blind men to truth. The guards who watched over these camps were often the same young soldiers who had fought their former enemies in Europe. Some treated the prisoners with indifference, others with resentment, but a few, like Private Carter back in France, carried with them a new understanding, one shaped not by battle, but by compassion. By 1946, Vogel's camp in Georgia began releasing prisoners in waves, repatriating them to a Germany that was now a shadow of its former self. He returned not as a captain, but as a man stripped of title and rank. Yet he carried something invisible with him, the faint memory of an American boy who had once looked at him without hatred. The Allies rebuilt Europe with steel and structure. Men like Vogel rebuilt themselves with silence and memory, and across the ocean, those who had guarded them faced their own reckoning, one that began not in war, but in peace. Back in Kansas, the war ended not with parades but with silence. The telegrams had stopped arriving. The black ribbons were gone from church doors. The world, for the first time in years, seemed to breathe again. But for those who had lived through it, even from behind a fence, peace carried its own kind of weight. Private James Carter returned home in the autumn of 1945. He was 19, lean and quieter than before. His parents greeted him with relief. Neighbors called him a hero, but he never saw himself that way. He had not stormed a beach or fought in a foxhole. His war had been spent in stillness, watching over men who had already lost theirs. Sometimes, late at night, he would take a folded piece of paper from his jacket, the drawing of the Atlantic with the words "Für den Frieden." He kept it pressed flat, its edges soft from years of handling. It reminded him that even in the depths of conflict, a man could still choose grace. Carter found work repairing tractors, later teaching at a local school. Life resumed ordinary and steady, yet the lessons of that camp stayed with him. When people spoke of the war as triumph, he nodded but said little. He had seen victory's face up close, and it looked nothing like glory. Across the ocean, Heinrich Vogel stepped onto German soil for the first time in 4 years. The Hamburg harbor was a skeleton of cranes and rusted ships. The smell of salt and ash hung in the air. Germany was unrecognizable, divided, humbled, hungry. He reunited with his wife and son in a refugee district near Kiel. Their home was gone, but their family remained intact. For months he did not wear his uniform. It was not shame that silenced him, it was reflection. He took up work as a dockhand, repairing boats for British occupation forces. The irony was not lost on him. A former U-boat commander patching the hulls of Allied ships, but perhaps that was fitting. The war had been about destruction, the peace about mending. In 1948, a letter arrived from America. It came through the International Red Cross, part of a POW correspondence program. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. It was from James Carter. "I don't know if you will ever get this," it read, "but I wanted you to know, and I still have your drawing. I hope you found peace, Captain." Vogel never replied. Not because he didn't wish to, but because he didn't know what words could carry such a truth across an ocean. Instead, he framed the letter and placed it on his desk, beside a small compass from his submarine days. It was enough. In the years that followed, both men aged quietly, one beneath the endless plains of America, the other beside the gray waters of the Baltic. They never met again, yet their story endured in the simplest of ways, as memory, as conscience, as proof that even amid the ruins of empires, humanity can still survive. For Vogel, the war had ended not in surrender but in recognition. For Carter, it had ended not in triumph, but in understanding, and perhaps that was the truest kind of victory of all. History remembers wars in numbers and names, in maps drawn by victors and monuments carved in stone. But wars truly end in smaller moments, in handshakes across fences, in the silence between words, in a piece of paper passed from one man to another. The story of Captain Heinrich Vogel and Private James Carter never made it into textbooks. It had no medals, no reports, no witnesses, yet it contained something far greater than conquest. It contained understanding. They came from worlds built to hate each other. One born to command, the other to obey. One trained to destroy, the other to defend. But in the ruins of ideology, they found a truth older than war itself, that every uniform hides a human being. That discovery, fragile, momentary, and unseen, was not a footnote of the war. It was its quiet redemption. When the world rebuilt itself, when nations rearmed and borders hardened again, their story remained hidden, in a folded drawing and an unreturned letter, in the memory of a young man who had once learned that mercy could stand guard beside duty. And perhaps that is where all wars truly end. Not when one flag falls and another rises, but when one man chooses to see the humanity in another. In that brief exchange between a German captain and an American guard, the 20th century's greatest conflict found its smallest, most profound peace, a peace without signatures or ceremonies, a peace that lived only in the hearts of two men who refused to see each other as enemies. And in that fleeting moment, on a cold morning behind the wire, the world, for the first time in years, felt human again.